I'd like for us to introduce Marty Purdy, who is the Director of Child Crisis Services for Centerstone in Louisville, Kentucky. I think you're really going to enjoy his presentation. Marty oversees an array of intensive outpatient, mobile crisis in-home, and school-based and residential crisis stabilization services. Marty has over 26 years of clinical experience with over 23 years focused in the delivery and administration of crisis services. The programs overseen by Marty divert 98% of the clients they serve from higher, more restrictive levels of care. Marty attributes a great deal of this success to the retention of strong, well-trained, mission-driven staff. Marty, I'm going to change so that you've got the screen. So Marty, can you take it away?
All right. Thank you very much, Carrie, and appreciate everybody's feedback. We really do want to encourage you guys to jump in at any point that you can with feedback and questions and interaction, because that's especially this subject is something that I think we could talk for a long time about. We can certainly commiserate with one another about the challenges of it. And that's what we're here today for. One thing I wanted to throw out there really quick, just based on our first questions we asked, was that, I think our next webinar is actually going to be about staff recruitment and retention that one of our colleagues is going to do. And I know that that's one of our biggest challenges, if not one of the single biggest challenges we face in our work, is number one, to be able to get people, and then to be able to train them, retain them, and get them to a place where we feel like not only do we feel like they're proficient, but more importantly, do they feel competent and proficient, which, is one of the, I think, foundations of being able to have a stable unit or milieu, no matter what kind of program you run. People have to feel good about the work they're doing. And sometimes that's a challenge for all of us. So we'll talk about that today. And it sounds like that is a common challenge that we're all facing. So, the question of whether we go hands-on or hands-off, I know in some cases for programs, that question may get answered by somebody else. It may be, just a preordained approach from a directive above us, but that'd be interesting to hear from people too about kind of how that decision is made with your programs. One thing I'll preface as well is the great lot of my experience is with the provision of child services. And one thing that's striking to me is that, a lot of data, a lot of reporting out there is from an adult perspective. There needs to be more. One thing that's clear in my research is that there needs to be more research done on all of this that we're talking about today. So a lot of what I'm talking about today, I'll come from a historically child-based experience. So I want to make sure that I cover ground that meets everybody's needs, whether it be child or adult population. So I'm going to try to be mindful of that. Let's see here. One of the things that we want to make sure we hit on today, defining restraint, talking about pros and cons. We'll talk a little bit about the history and some stats around restraint specifically. We'll talk a little bit about seclusion as well, but mostly we're going to strictly be talking about restraint, common theories and approaches. We'll talk a lot about mission and philosophy in relation to restraint, kind of the historical mission around it, as well as our program-specific mission and approach. Kind of the middle part of what we talk about today is going to be specifically our program-specific approach to reducing restraints and a little bit of feedback to you guys about how we feel like we got there. And I'll show you some data around that. If there's going to be, I know a lot of programs out there have a no restraint policy. You don't put hands on kids, period. And so if that's the case, then what do you do? You know, designing crisis and safety plans as a program. We'll talk a lot throughout this thing about client and staff implications, about how it affects them, how they drive what we do. Involvement with community partners and with law enforcement, which is, you know, a whole other presentation, honestly. And then how to know if what we're doing works. And hopefully we'll have some sufficient time at the end to really get into some Q&A. First off, simply one good definition of restraint that I found that you guys can see here. Okay, so everybody can see that now, I hope. The deprivation or restriction of liberty or freedom of action or movement is one good definition. Next one here, this is the Medicare and Medicaid definition of restraint. Any manual method, physical or mechanical device, material or equipment that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a person to move his or her arms, legs, body, or head freely. And I want to, you know, everybody kind of soak that in for a second. You know, we can sometimes get ourselves a bit desensitized to, you know, what this really is. There's no question and no way to get around the fact that this isn't a nice, good thing that happens when we have to put our hands on people. When we look at this definition and we put ourselves in that place, I think we can all agree that it's not something any of us want to go through. And I think by nature, it's a pretty traumatic thing. So that's kind of the basis and the fundamental, you know, standpoint that we're working from. Again, seclusion, we need to just throw it in there as well, because a lot of times seclusion is used in the place of restraint. But, and again, that really is a whole other discussion that could warrant a lot of time. But a definition that's a good one here: the involuntary confinement of a person alone in a room or area from which the person is physically prevented from leaving. Again, not an experience that any of us generally are going to want to sign up for. You know, on our unit, we do not use seclusion. We have a child crisis stabilization unit that has 12 beds. And what we do use, you know, we will use kids' rooms. They can choose to go to their room to calm down, take some time alone, that kind of thing, but we do not use their rooms as seclusion. We have a sensory room that a lot of our children use as a coping tool. Matter of fact, our staff use that room as well. I use that room. It's a cool space to go, and there's good lighting in there. You can change the lighting. There are sensory, you know, we have a weighted blanket. There's a big bean bag in there. You can turn the lights down. There's some special lighting that puts designs on the ceiling, looks like stars and stuff. It has turned out to be a really low cost, very highly effective space that we use. So we're really happy about that. We've had that for about a year. Here's some, you know, just some visual examples of restraint, and it kind of, you know, gives you some different sides of the coin. I think for us that do this kind of work, this is what we think about more of, you know, 3 or 4 point restraints on a bed, or more of the justice side of things, where we're looking at shackles, things like that. So negative connotations, but there are other, obviously, I guess, positive types of restraint. Some of them are fun, like on a roller coaster, you probably do want some restraint where you don't move much. And you want your kids well restrained in their car seat. So just, some perspective. Same thing with seclusion. I think generally when we think of things, the images are the types of ones we see here. They are, generally negative connotations when you think about it. However, we all benefit from some positive seclusion sometimes, like this person out in the mountains hanging out. We could all probably use that right now, sitting on the beach by ourselves or whatever. So there are positive and negative connotations, but generally, especially for the population we serve, it's negative. So let's dive into some specific pros and cons of restraint.
Right now you're on the pros slide.
Yes.
Maintaining safety, it creates a controlled environment and it maintains level of care and serves a population with higher need. And getting back to what we're all about here is, I think this is really challenging because I think there are individuals who are who maybe are involuntary and brought into crisis, who are so agitated that it's really challenging not to restrain. And so I think that's a real issue and part of the dilemma, because we absolutely have to keep our staff safe and we have to keep our clients safe. And so the restraint has to be, if we can do it, it has to be the last resort. Absolutely. So are you back with us technically now?
I think so. Yeah.
Hey, all right. All right.
So with cons, same thing. I put possibly creates increased risk. I think there's no question that the cons of having hands-on approaches definitely creates increased risk that we have to deal with. Second, also inhibiting therapeutic trust. We have to be able to be prepared for what we're going into. If we get involved in this, we're compromising, or at least running the risk of compromising therapeutic trust with our clients. Can be traumatizing. Safe to say it is traumatizing. It's costly to train and maintain, and restrictive to time, money, people, all of our resources. We talked about this at the beginning, but it's hard to find staff who are willing and able to do hands-on interventions. It's something that you'll hear a lot of people say, I don't get paid enough to do that. That's some of the feedback I've gotten before. One of the funny things about my team, our crisis stabilization unit has been around almost 20 years, and myself included, and a lot of the staff that work on the unit, we've been working here for 20 years. Let's face it, we're getting old. Having to do physical interventions can get, getting down on your knees and doing anything and be able to get back up again can be a challenge ourselves. So, we're getting old. It's hard to do some of this stuff, not to mention, other risks that are involved. The cost of retention and the manpower time are certainly things that you have to consider. All right, some history and data. A lot of what has driven the movement to get away from, at least recently, to get away from physical restraint has come from SAMHSA. They reported in 2003 approximately 50 to 150 people die from seclusion and restraint every year. Thousands more injured and traumatized. And, frankly, I think these numbers are historically underreported, so they are likely higher. Great Britain is when I was doing research on this, Great Britain's doing a lot of the current research on this and addressing this head on. And in 2016, they're reporting, over 3,600 injuries to patients, 2,600 injuries to staff due to restraints in their psychiatric settings. One thing that stands out, even though a lot of the data and talk are about adults, children are restrained a lot more than adults are across the board. especially when you factor in all types of settings, whether it be schools, detention centers, psychiatric settings. Across the board, they get hands put on them a lot more, and frankly, they are underrepresented. Um, Children 12 and under are restrained most often, but youth ages 18 to 24 are restrained for longer periods of time. They tend to be longer, more escalated restraint episodes, and that's important to remember. Here's some common, products and approaches that I think a lot of you guys will be familiar with if you do use some type of physical management tool at your sites. Our particular program uses this one, Safe Crisis Management. It's prevention focused, de-escalation focused. Pretty much all these programs are very similar, focused on safety, response, pre-planning with clients, making sure environments are safe to start with, they're trauma informed, and this is when this one started. CPI is another one that a lot of people use, been around about the same amount of time, safety focused, environmentally focused. Same thing, prevention and trauma informed. There's about 15 different kind of tools that are available out there. They're all pretty similar. This one, Safety Care, is a little bit different. Focuses on applied behavioral analysis a little bit more as a focus. I'll be interested to hear from any of you guys that may use this one. Positive behavioral intervention focused, and it's a little bit newer, having started in 1994. But most of these programs that are out there are very similar, and you'll see the progression of those programs move from really a lot of their training and focus at first was on the holds and how to do them. Of course, they still do that, but there's been a huge shift towards verbal de-escalation and pre-planning to avoid physical intervention. And obviously that makes sense, and it's a good trend that we are fortunate to see happening. Mission and philosophy. Again, SAMHSA and federal mandates to decrease, if not eliminate, physical restraint, seclusion, and behavioral health care. It makes sense. It creates a pretty big debate. And I think that debate is healthy and it needs to be there. But the whole thinking around, trying to rule it out, phase it out, is very similar to the Zero Suicide Initiative. And the fact that I think it's important not to presume that, we're going to ensure that there's never an incident where we have to physically assist someone. However, the goal should be that we don't have any. The only acceptable goal is to have zero, much like suicide. Trauma informed. This whole movement, if you go back and look, was very timely and followed a very similar timeline for when trauma-informed care started becoming more mainstream. So it makes sense that this all kind of came out concurrently. It's morally and ethically indicated that it be minimized. And again, restraint by definition is harmful both physically and psychologically. Must be least restrictive and last resort. We'll talk about that a lot. We've talked about preemptive, that it needs to be preemptive. It needs to be monitored by an independent body, by folks who don't really, have a specific dog in the fight, so to speak. Human dignity has to be preserved, and that is a challenge with this. Psychological, emotional, and physical safety, again, paramount. Serious adverse effects are possible with seriously mentally ill population. I'm sure there's folks out there that are listening that work with this population, and my guess is you don't do physical hands-on interventions with these folks, but I would like to hear if you do. It is a challenge because of the possible adverse effects. And it's
Marty,
something that,
I can weigh in on that one about
yeah,
with the severely mentally ill population. There are some times when we do have to restrain an adult who might have schizophrenia and might be so agitated, or someone with bipolar, especially, who is so agitated, especially if they're causing harm to themselves or others. Yeah, it is. We are definitely aware that restraint can be traumatizing itself, but if the person is on the verge of um, hanging themselves or on the verge of assaulting someone else, we have to lay hands on. So it is. It's really tricky, and the challenge is helping the staff know what they're doing, know how to do it, and but also know how not to do it. So how to avoid doing it as much as possible.
yeah, I appreciate that, Carrie, because honestly, your definition of when you would do that really resonates with when you should do it with anybody. Again, that trauma-informed approach of really only doing it when you absolutely have to, when the risk of harm outweighs, other potential harming effects of intervening. So that makes sense. Again, internal review of all this is really critical. Um, Discussing, there's some argument that the use of restraint represents a failure clinically to provide proper care and protection to clients. That's one of those kind of devil's advocate arguments, but it's something I think that, deep down we all feel like, wow, I wish it hadn't got to this point. Uh, I think the key to that is uh, debriefing and following up and learning from every single episode. What could we have done differently, and what can we learn from this? And in that respect, it's no longer a failure. Let's see. And again, further on mission and philosophy. Um, Got to have adequate staffing and training. Um, that's both an ethical and professional responsibility. Yet, here's the reality that we're talking about: is man, it's hard to find that adequate staffing and training. And on any given day in any of our programs, um, you know, it can change like the wind. And then what do you do? So we do the best we can there. However, I think we have to really fight the good fight with um, who provides our resources, who pays us, who gives us the authority to hire more people and put more money into that resource. I know myself, I'm constantly fighting the battle of saying, and I use the word risk a lot. Our risk goes up every time we get staffing, cut. Do we really want to do that? And that's something that I think we have to really fight that battle and put that out there. Adequate staffing is a challenge, and it's a whole other dilemma that can lend to an unsettled milieu. Um,
And Marty, if I could just weigh in on that,
yeah,
I have to say, if staff are, if they're feeling scared, it's going to be much worse in terms of restraint. And if they feel overworked, then they're going to be more resentful of the crisis client. And even the best people, when they're scared, it's more of an emotional reaction instead of the logical clinical response. So, adequate staffing with quality staff, that's absolutely crucial.
yeah, we could spend the whole time talking about that because it really is one of the most crucial things. I'll tell a quick story about, you know, our staffing can get challenging. We had a really good staff member who is a leader on our unit who, like you said, even the best staff can get overwhelmed and have certain buttons pushed. I had a particular staff member one time state in front of our whole milieu, in front of the kids, in front of the unit, that, if we get one more child admitted to this unit, we're going to lose control and have to manage everybody. Some kind of statement kind of like that. And, they almost didn't realize what they were saying, and because he was saying a lot more than that. It was almost an invitation to, hey, guess what? We're starting to feel out of control. If you guys want to do whatever you want, now's a great time to try. So it gave me an opportunity to do it was a teaching moment to follow up about, number one, he had a very valid concern, but on the other hand, that was not the time or the place. But I always have to put that on myself. In my opinion, that's on me to address, because his concerns were real and they were true. Our staff can take on a lot of secondary trauma, a lot of secondary anxiety, and almost develop their own PTSD symptoms. And what I've found that on my unit is that peer feedback to one another, the peers catching it with each other, saying, hey, are you doing okay? Do you need to take a break? Let me step in. That's one of the most beautiful things and one of the best things we have gained from the work we've done in this. Moving on, our zero management goal approach, getting into kind of what we were trying to do. We started around 2012 with this, and we called it a zero restraint initiative. And when I first heard about it, I was skeptical. I'd been doing this a long time, and felt like what we were doing worked. And I'd never heard. I'll be honest, I had not heard. At that point, I had not heard of the Zero Suicide Initiative. So the idea of zero restraint, I thought they were getting ready to take away, our training and make us run a unit without that as an option. So I was ready to fight this thing. Needless to say, I've come around to being a proponent of this approach. But at first, I, along with my staff and a lot of people, panicked. But as I learned more about what this was really coming from and dove into what Samsha was, trying to accomplish with this, what we did was keep it clear. We kept it simple, and that helped a lot. It was a small team that started this initiative, very clear, team-driven, limited goals. First thing we decided to do was, well, we've got too many people getting trained in this. A lot of them don't really use it or use it enough. Too many different ways to train it. Kind of different. We have a big agency. There's 1,500 people in our agency. We serve 30,000 clients a year. So a lot of people doing this in different ways. It wasn't getting tracked very well, and it wasn't getting reported well. It was getting underreported. So first thing we did is look at, does everybody need to be doing this? And we learned really quickly, no, we got too many people getting trained on this. Where do we really need it? Where do we need to focus on it? We reduced that by 2/3, from 350 staff to about 50. We established clear guidelines about where and when we want to use it. So we shrunk down. That was scary. A lot of people were anxious about, well, again, what are we going to do instead? Who's going to help us in these situations? So we started answering those questions. One of the first things that was helpful, with questions was feedback. We wanted to make sure that feedback to people was very readily available, less punitive. Our QI department, our quality improvement department helped drive this, and it became a very collaborative experience. I don't know about y'all, but our relationship with our quality improvement office hasn't always been or felt collaborative. Sometimes it felt kind of like punitive feedback coming down from the top. We've changed that culture, and it has been one of the lifesavers for our whole agency, not just this initiative. And I'll talk some more about that as we go along. I've already hit on this. What did we learn? We found this approach to be successful, and I'll get into the meat of that in a minute. We decreased incidents greatly, and our positive outcomes increased. I was frankly surprised at the level of success, and also really pleasantly surprised by the staff buy-in, how remarkable that was. Our adverse incidents, our crisis incidents, drastically reduced, and flip side of that, morale and retention went up. I think we've been doing a lot of other initiatives to address morale and attention of staff. This is one of several, but I think this one, as much as any other, really increased the morale of our staff because they became involved in this process with us actively and didn't feel like it was something getting handed down to them. They became a part of it as we built it, and that was all the difference. More about what we learned. I've already talked about how things were underreported, and that was especially important to get a handle on that. We tightened up our reporting requirements, but we made reporting easier. We really focused on our incident report. Used to be 4 pages long. It's now 1 page. Pretty much anything we do anymore, as y'all know, man, it needs to be 1 page. If we can get it down to something simple, pretty much everything's electronic for us now. It was all paper-based just a few years ago. You can imagine how cumbersome that was.
Marty, if I can weigh in, I think that's wonderful. A way to get something done consistently is to make it as easy as possible, to make it easy to do the right thing. So I'm really glad that a solution like making the incident report 1 page completely changed your monitoring of restraints.
Yeah. And feedback becomes more immediate. It's almost immediate feedback now, and people appreciate that. And that makes a huge difference. If you don't get feedback about something that happened 2 weeks or a month ago, it really doesn't mean as much. So that's another critical thing we learned. One thing we learned about staff is, they not only want to look good as to, am I doing a good job? They want to know that they're doing a good job. It translated, again, into them feeling better, and it pulled them into providing better care. So they really bought in. This is when I really thought they bought into trauma-informed care more, is when we started doing this initiative. Both these things looked at together made sense to them, and it started informing everything we do. I tell our staff, there's a therapeutic way to help a kid tie a shoe. We get little kids on our unit. We might have to help them blow their nose or tie their shoe, whatever. There's a therapeutic way to do it, and there's a wrong way to do it too. And so sometimes it's those little things. Staff increase their self and peer accountability, and that drives our success. Holding themselves accountable and looking at each other, hey, how are we doing? And that's a beautiful thing to see when you see it in action. Our staff became the trainers. One of my main staff, he's the one that does the training. He's one of 3 people in our agency that do all the training. That really creates a buy-in. And staff are engaged in the data. They want to see, how are we doing? Again, we used to have a real fragmented response to things like this, where we had different, we had people on our unit who they felt like they knew what they were doing when it comes to this kind of work. And they were more about power and control. I don't let anything get out of hand. I'm the boss around here. They're going to know it. We shifted from that kind of focus and thinking to more of a team response. And that, again, was a lifesaver and something we could spend, a whole other hour on. Self-identified identified roles and strengths. People, they found new strengths, things that they were good at that they didn't realize. They realized, wow, I'm actually good and engaging with kids more than I thought I was, instead of jumping straight into, hey, follow the rules, do this, do that. It increased their positive relationship with our clients. We had a couple of
Yeah,
staff. Yeah,
Marty, sounds like it was the shift from rule enforcement to treatment and care of clients.
absolutely. We really were, staff hung tightly onto rule enforcement because in their minds that's what created the safety and the order on the unit. We really did make a shift from having that focus to know what really creates and establishes order and safety on the unit is the clients themselves and how they are feeling. Do they feel safe? And do we as staff feel safe? And what's the tenor and the tone of our program, even if we do have to resort to using an intervention like this? So our staff taught us, our clients taught us a lot about that. We gave our staff, they've always wanted and needed a lot of voice and investment into who we admitted as clients. But it used to be more complaint about, we don't want to admit this kid, this kid's not going to, do well here. I know we're going to have to put our hands on this kid. Used to hear that a lot. We don't hear that kind of talk anymore. It's more about, hey, how can we help this kid? They could be a challenge. Let's learn about what we can do to help them de-escalate. What are some of their coping strategies coming in the door that we can use? And when they leave our unit, what can we have them walk out of here as coping strategies that they can continue to use so they can, have a better trajectory as they leave our unit. So our staff buy into our mission. They buy into it, and not only do they buy into it, they defend it. And our staff report feeling safer. And I included real quick, just for you to look at, our staff mission statement, which we built this about 18 years ago at a retreat. Our staff wrote it themselves. We spent a lot of time. We spent a whole retreat working on what our mission statement was going to be, and it drives what we do. And it's a little wordy, it's a little bit repetitive, but it was our staff's word, so I didn't want to mess with it too much. And I think it's beautiful, and it has stood the test of time. Actually, we did it in March of 2000, so that's 19 years ago. And it still stands strong today, and we have it posted on our unit outside, along with, a saying that we say a lot, which is, we're going to remind kids that they're kids when they come through this door. A lot of kids who come through our door are carrying the yoke and the burden of way too much, kind of carrying the world on their shoulders, and they've forgotten that they're children. They're going to come to our unit and have fun and get nurtured while they're still working hard on some things. And that drives what we do. Just real quickly, I'm going to get into just some data that we track all of this, and this is our bread and butter that gives us feedback about how we did. We don't have this data starts in 2012, and this is 12 through 16 right here on this slide. So it doesn't show numbers from prior to 2012, but what I can tell you is there was more of a dramatic shift in those couple years leading up to this. Our numbers were even higher than these 46, 43, 45 numbers that you see here. So there was even a bigger shift down. And then, we stabilized for 2 or 3 years here. And then all of a sudden, a couple years into this initiative, we went down to 22 physical interventions. That's for our whole agency right there. So that is quite drastic. For our crisis unit, these are numbers here from 17, 18, and 19. Again, pretty steady. We're about half of where we used to be when we're in the 20s here. And again, though, a drastic shift down again after a couple more years here, this past year, at 9 physical interventions. um,
Hey, Marty, can I ask you a question?
yeah.
Are your clients voluntary or involuntary? I know they're children, so they don't necessarily have to agree to be there because their parents would probably sign them in. But are they willing to engage or not? What if a child would absolutely refuse to walk into your unit?
Well, that's a really good question that has a lot of layers to it, but the long and short of it is that we're a voluntary unit. Um, but really, the line is we won't bring a child onto our unit by force. That's really the bottom line. We spent 3 hours or longer talking a kid into coming and staying on our unit. We put a lot of investment in that. So we'll put whatever time we need into, convincing a child to stay here of their own accord. But we will not physically manage a client onto the unit. We'll do everything else that it takes, and we will do that and do that all the time. But that's kind of the line. Um, and what we find is that usually, uh, out of we serve 430 kids this past year, and that's about how many we serve every year. Um, we may have 4 or 5 kids out of that number that we ultimately can't keep here because they just flat out refuse. That's kind of where that is and what it looks like. These are just some program numbers to kind of compare. And what you see is our CSU right there in the middle has, compared to other programs in the agency, some high numbers comparatively. The other program you see over here, Western, it's a day treatment program with very similar level of care clients, literally the same clients a lot of times. So that's why you see those numbers that are similar. But again, you can see this is 2013. We had 13 physical restraints, 21 in 2014, back down to 13 in 2015, and then a notable drop to 9 in 2016. Again, a study by CIT. In 2017, we had 8. So here we are this past year at 8 kids, or the year before, 8 restraints. We were doing 40 something just a few years ago, just to put it in perspective. Some of the other things we're tracking real quick. We track injuries. That drives what we need to know about what we're doing. We also track length of time that kids are being put in holds. And it's good to see that most of our holds are taking place less than 2 minutes. Very few lasting, much longer. You learn a lot more from these that last up to 30 minutes. But we don't want to go there. We're trying to avoid that. We're also tracking age. Our average age, and this chart's kind of hard to read, but our average age is that 6 to 10 age group. And that's across the board. Real quick, I want to be mindful of time. We've reduced the length of hold significantly, and utilization of it all around has reduced. I've already talked about some of this.
Marty, do you think the shift to 0 restraints came about by letting the staff know that other things worked better, that intervening earlier, that starting earlier with the client might have helped? There's a story you told me before about how you used to have like a restraint squad that would get called in when a kid was acting up. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And it talks about a little bit on this page where we made a shift from power and control to nurture and heal. I am not ashamed to say I pillaged a lot of my staff from other programs in the region. There was a particular residential program that I think was a pretty tough place to work, and I hired one person from that program, and next thing, word of mouth kind of took place, and started hiring a lot of other people from that program. That that program, those staff reported they were doing upwards of 10 to 15 managements a day, some of those lasting hours at a time. They had lots of horror stories to tell. What I learned about those folks, they were really skilled, really good at everything they did, but their go-to skill was management. Um, and their language was driven by, I can handle anything. It was very much a power and control language. The beautiful thing is we watch some of those people morph into people who now their strength is de-escalation. They used to be though, they used to be the squad, the guys that everybody called, hey, get this guy down here so he can, fix this situation. I think of this one particular guy now, Josh, who you look at him and yeah, he could put any of us on the ground in a second and we would not be able to get out of it, of a hold. But he's turned into a guy who is my best de-escalator. He's the most genteel teddy bear. He's just a highly skilled therapeutic intervener. And it was beautiful to see that shift over time. And real quickly, another thing I'll say is we had a couple of people who had to leave. They needed to go. They weren't able to make this shift. And what I'm proud of, though, is they were able to kind of be aware of that of their own accord and realize, that this isn't really for me. I need to do something different. And so it turned in most cases to a good step for them to take. But it was one of those situations where we kind of needed to coach those folks out of here of what they're doing. Talking more about accountability. All this is driven by a small agency-wide team of reviewers. We meet very regularly, once a month, and then we have a quarterly, more engaged follow-up to provide more engaged data and detail. We provide feedback in real time, right away. As soon as we get a report, we're responding back right away to drive change. And we're given data, that data you see, we're providing it directly to our staff so they can see, in more than one dimension what they're doing. And again, I can't say this enough, but it's collaborative and not punitive in nature. If you have a program that doesn't use restraint, what to do instead. Really, it's about crisis planning and having a plan that is critical to be site, not only agency specific, but very specific to your site, from the top down, side to side, and from the bottom up. Learning from everybody involved. One of the biggest things we learn is that you want to learn from everybody, especially we learn that our support staff were saying, hey, don't forget about us. We need to know what to do if somebody presents to us in an out of control situation. So it needs to be built by folks at every level, built by teams and the teams that use them. You need to establish exclusionary criteria for your population. Again, most of that's done for us ahead of time, but I think it's important to include staff in that. And you need to have contingency plans that include outside assistance and cooperation. Designing a crisis plan, things to consider. How do you define crisis within your own setting? Know as much about your clients at the outset that you can. And I think, we all know that, but it's easy to forget. Be clear on who's going to respond and how. That's one of the biggest problems. Is so often I get feedback about, well, we didn't know what to do, so we just did this. Well, try to know ahead of time who's going to be point, who's going to be the point person, and then who's going to step in and let everybody else know what's going on. And then consider, spatial environment issues. Is there an audience that we need to get rid of or address? Are people getting traumatized by watching what's going on? Are they getting pulled into what's going on? If staff are left alone with a client, what do they do? because that you don't see coming sometimes. So you need to be prepared for it. Being especially mindful of space and environment. We've already talked a lot about implications, but you need to have a lot of this built in ahead of time with training and planning. During the actual escalation incident is not the best time to address these things. Encourage staff to openly identify what their lines in the sand are. I won't do this. I won't have a client do that to me or say that to me. You really got to work on those things ahead of time and define, well, you know, what are your buttons? What are your lines? And you need to know when you need to ask for help to be able to get through a situation with a client like that. Identify power struggles before they grow. Address the fact that staff bring in their own baggage and stressors that can escalate a milieu. Ask staff directly what they need for support in this process and include everybody. Trust gut feelings. If you don't feel good about a situation, and teach your staff this, then trust it, go with it. Encourage peer-driven solutions when possible. Always look for alternatives to help de-escalate. One thing for sure, if you're going to involve law enforcement, I do want to spend a second on this real quick. You don't know what you're going to get. You might get some of this. Not what you expected at all. You really don't want this guy showing up in most cases. In my opinion, you want something kind of more like this. Is my favorite two people on the planet right here, I think. But they're calm, they're balanced, they're person-centered. They have a sense of humor about situations, but it's not personal. It's not something, you know, they're going to use it as a positive tool. They're genuine, they're warm. That's the kind of approach that you're going to want to be taking. So building a relationship with law enforcement in your community, having a plan built with them ahead of time. Are they CIT trained, crisis intervention trained, which is very important. Do you have a memorandum of agreement with them that states clearly, what are they going to do when they come to help you out? Do you have an expectation of response times, and they're going to try to stick to it? And what's their involvement going to be? And are there limitations about it? What can they do and not do for you? It's been stated that if we do involve police, that we're criminalizing our clients. We're kind of helping push them down that track of the judiciary track. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that we want to be, again, least restrictive when we do it. How do we know if what we're doing works? Real quick, make sure to have a rigorous review process, keep ongoing data, ask your clients, they'll let you know. They'll also show you in their behavior. And then same thing with your staff. A good general rule of practice is if you practice a lot, but you don't have to use physical interventions, then you're doing it right, and the numbers won't lie. So that's kind of it. I hate that we had to rush through a little bit of this, but I think it gives you a gist of where our approach is.
Absolutely, Marty. I think these were wonderful, wonderful points that you bring up, and the improvement in your agency is just remarkable. And we know that there are times when some of us have to use restraints, but really looking at approaching it from a zero restraint approach, I think makes a big difference, because if we can look at how we can treat and nurture and care for our clients instead of getting into power and control. And I love that story about the guy who could take down anyone but turned out to be the best verbal de-escalator. I really appreciate that. I want to really thank Marty for sharing his experience. There's a lot of things for us to think about in moving from power and control to care and concern. Remember to complete your survey at the end of the presentation, and we hope you can join our next webinar, Retaining and Engaging Your Crisis Staff, coming up soon in September. Thanks to all of you, and we hope that you can join the Crisis Residential Association and see you in Grand Rapids in Michigan in October.
Thanks, guys.